Hi guys, this is Tushar here from Pottery by Chance, and I'm gonna attempt throwing a vase today. Starting off with the basics of centering the clay, and once it's centered, then start forming the indent, trying to get in and ensuring that there's enough depth available and enough base that I can play with later on for trimming. Once I'm done with that, then I slowly start pulling the walls up. Before I start pulling the walls, I need to prepare the walls by compressing them, just so that the clay typically has the tendency of moving outwards and also getting a little soft. So the attempt here is to kind of just stabilize the walls, and while doing that, pulling up the clay, all the while ensuring that the mouth is a little wide so that you're not left with too little clay at the top. And so I kind of do that to kind of pull up the walls up and coning it inwards so that the clay doesn't start spreading out, thereby making it very difficult to get it back in. Once I'm done with that, I use my sponge to kind of create that pressure on the outside so that I pull up the clay from the bottom right up to the top. That ensures that I take out all the excess clay at the bottom and actually use that to build height. Uh, and while I'm doing that, obviously, the idea is to always keep the clay moist, and not by using too much water, but yes, enough for my hands to kind of slip onto the clay and not get stuck. And then I also use my index finger in the form of a curve to kind of pull that uh, clay up from the bottom. The idea is to have multiple such pulls, which ensures that any excess clay at the bottom is pulled up, and the clay is efficiently distributed across the height. And this also obviously gives us the extra height uh, with the same amount of clay. And this is something that has taken some time for me to kind of practice. While my earlier pieces typically used to have a fair bit of clay at the bottom, making it very bottom heavy. But over time, consciously trying to uh, practice the art of pulling all the clay from the bottom all the way up has actually helped me even out the clay distribution. One common test that most potters online have recommended, and which I think is very useful in the early days, is to kind of cut a cross section of your piece and check the thickness of the walls right from the bottom to the top. And the more you kind of have an even thickness, the more it kind of becomes a much more efficient piece. And that's a practice that I kind of started off. Obviously, it's a little laborious, uh, and pottery does teach you to kind of be a little forgiving with your pieces. At the end of the day, the idea is to learn the right things the right way. And in cases where like in my case, where I don't really have I've never really learned in a classroom setting, these small tests and these small practice throwing actually makes it all the more worthwhile. And then I use my rib to kind of shape it a bit in the form of a vase by giving it a belly, but all the and leave the top part. I kind of you work on the top part once I've fixed the bottom and the belly. Primarily, the idea here is to not overwork the top, because tired clay or too much water in the clay also tends to spoil the piece over a period of time, because the more stressed out the clay is, I've found the more difficult it is to shape it and get it back in. So I normally work on one part of the clay, starting with the bottom, kind of pushing the bottom in and then bellying it out a bit, giving it the shape of a vase. Broad contours are coming up. I then basically use a hard rib, which is like a wooden rib, to shape it by pushing the clay inwards at the bottom, and then kind of continuing the shape of the belly, and kind of building that contour uh, along the walls. That's the the idea is to kind of start making it look like a vase from a cylinder that I showed you earlier. Pottery also kind of teaches you some very valuable life lessons in terms of how to completely focus on your life, and how to also learn to disassociate. And I've been guilty of not disassociating with it, primarily when it comes to the finishing stages, because once you've kind of have the piece in front of you, you always want to do that little bit more to make it look a little more aesthetic or a little more curvy. And what happens in the bargain is you end up working the clay to a point where it becomes very difficult for the clay to hold on to its shape. And so I think that valuable learning of how to kind of learn to disassociate with it after a point, and not fiddle with it too much, also is very, very important, especially if you're working with the same piece of clay for a long period of time. Clay tends to start getting tired with all the water and the pulling, and so it's very important that you work on different parts of clay. And now that I've kind of worked on the base and the belly, now I start working on the top of it, where I try to kind of cone it in and create the neck. And it takes a bit of work, it takes a bit of effort to kind of get it right. And most importantly, it is the speed, where you lower the speed of the wheel to ensure that it doesn't go out of control. And that sense is something that only comes with practice, which I've learned. And here, I think the key is to keep it a little wet, but not too wet, so that it doesn't really stick to its shape. And use a rib. So I here kind of use a silicone rib, which kind of has the softness, but is still firm enough for me to at least start shaping the neck in a desired curve. And that also gives a very nice proportion to the neck as compared to the belly. And there is excess clay at the top, which I normally cut off using my needle tool. This is something that's again a learning. It's something that always happens when you push a lot of clay to the top. There are always chances where you will have uneven through at the top, and the smartest thing is to kind of cut it out, so that you can then start shaping the rest of your piece. Just adding some finishing touches in terms of fixing the mouth, the lip, and also the neck, just to ensure that the curvature is just right in terms of the proportion to the belly. I think that's very important. Most of the famous potters typically spend a lot of time in getting these proportions right. Obviously, starting off, it takes a lot of practice. It's not an exact science, but I think with practice, one kind of gets a hang of what should be the proportions of the belly to the foot to the lip to the neck. So I think these proportions play a big role in terms of how aesthetically appealing the pot is. Another hygiene thing: remove water from the base to avoid any ice cracks, and obviously smoothen the lip. That's something that I consciously ensure, so that there's no undulations on the mouth of the vase. Another important thing that I've started doing is to ensure that as much of the trimming is done before the pot is taken off the wheel. This just ensures a lot more efficient way of throwing, reduces the amount of work during trimming, and adding some patterns to the bottom also ensures that the glaze, it kind of gets caught there and doesn't really flow off onto the kiln shelves. So that's another interesting facet of pottery throwing, which I've kind of learned from a lot of potters online. And then the vase is done,